Welcome back to my channel. The house was quiet, too quiet. Emily sat on the edge of the couch, her fingers tracing the rim of a half-empty coffee mug. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching into an eternity. Mark had been gone for 3 days this time, another business trip that left her alone in their suburban home. She glanced at the photo on the mantel. The two of them on their wedding day, smiling, oblivious to the cracks that would one day form. A soft thud broke the silence. Emily turned to see Max, their golden retriever, trotting into the room with something in his mouth. His tail wagged furiously, as if he'd discovered treasure. "What do you have this time, you idiot?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with amusement. Max dropped the object at her feet, a mismatched sock, one she didn't recognize. She picked it up, examining it with a frown. "Where did you even find this?" Max barked, his brown eyes gleaming with mischief. This was his routine whenever Mark was away, scavenging the house for random items and presenting them to Emily like gifts. At first, it had been annoying, but over time she'd come to find it endearing. It was as if Max knew she needed distractions, something to fill the void left by Mark's absence. Emily sighed and set the sock aside. She reached down to scratch Max behind the ears, his warm fur grounding her in the moment. "You're a good boy, aren't you?" she murmured. Max leaned into her touch, his tail still wagging. The doorbell rang, startling her. Max bolted to the door, barking excitedly. Emily followed, smoothing her hair and wiping the sleepiness from her eyes. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, she was met with a stranger, a man in his mid-30s with tousled dark hair and a friendly smile. He held a leash in one hand, and at his feet sat a small, scruffy terrier. "Hi," he said, his voice warm and inviting. "I'm Jake. I just moved in next door. I think our dogs might have exchanged something." He held up a familiar-looking sock, and Emily's cheeks flushed. "Oh," she said, laughing nervously. "That explains where Max got this." She held up the mismatched sock, and Jake chuckled. "Looks like we've got a sock thief on our hands," he said, glancing down at Max, who was now sniffing Jake's terrier with great interest. Emily stepped aside, gesturing for Jake to come in. "I'm Emily, by the way. And this troublemaker is Max." "Nice to meet you, Emily," Jake said, stepping inside. His presence filled the room, and Emily couldn't help but notice how different he felt from Mark. Where Mark was reserved and distant, Jake was open and engaging. They sat in the living room, the dogs playing at their feet. Jake told her about his recent move, his job as a freelance photographer, and his love for animals. Emily found herself laughing more than she had in weeks. "So, what about you?" Jake asked, leaning forward slightly. "What do you do when you're not chasing after sock-stealing dogs?" Emily hesitated, her gaze drifting to the wedding photo on the mantel. "I'm between jobs right now," she said, avoiding the deeper truth. "Mostly just trying to keep this one out of trouble." She gestured to Max, who was now sprawled on the floor, belly up. Jake smiled, but there was a knowing look in his eyes, as if he sensed there was more to her story. "Well, if you ever need a break, I'm just next door. And I've got plenty of socks to spare." They both laughed, and for a moment, Emily forgot about the quiet house, the ticking clock, and the ache in her chest. When Jake left, promising to return the sock he'd borrowed, Emily stood at the door, watching him walk back to his house. Max sat beside her, his head tilted as if trying to read her thoughts. "What are you looking at?" she asked, ruffling his fur. Max barked once, then trotted back into the house, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. She closed the door, the quiet settling over her once more. But this time it felt different. There was a spark of something, curiosity maybe, or hope. She glanced at the mismatched socks still sitting on the coffee table and smiled. Max returned, this time with a tennis ball in his mouth. He dropped it at her feet and looked up at her expectantly. "You're relentless, you know that," Emily said, picking up the ball. She tossed it down the hallway, and Max bounded after it, his joy infectious. As she watched him play, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The house was still quiet, but it no longer felt empty. The days blurred together, each one marked by the same routine: waking up to an empty bed, sipping coffee in silence, and taking Max for his morning walk. But something had changed since Jake moved in next door. Emily found herself glancing out the window more often, her heart skipping a beat whenever she saw him in his yard or heard his voice calling to his terrier, Benny. It was on one such morning that Jake appeared at her doorstep again, this time holding a leash in each hand. "Morning," he said, his smile as bright as the sun filtering through the trees. "I was wondering if you and Max wanted to join us for a walk. Benny could use the company, and I could use the conversation." Emily hesitated, her fingers tightening around Max's leash. "I don't know." "Come on," Jake said, his tone playful but earnest. "It's just a walk. What's the worst that could happen?" She laughed despite herself, the sound surprising her. "Okay, fine. But if Max steals anything else, I'm blaming you." They set off down the tree-lined street, the dogs trotting side by side. The air was crisp, the kind of morning that made everything feel fresh and full of possibility. Jake talked easily, his words flowing like a river, and Emily found herself drawn in by his stories. He told her about his travels, the places he'd photographed, and the people he'd met along the way. "It sounds amazing," Emily said, her voice tinged with longing. "I've always wanted to travel, but—" she trailed off, her gaze dropping to the pavement. "But what?" Jake asked, his tone gentle. She shrugged, avoiding his eyes. "Life gets in the way, I guess." Jake didn't press her, but she could feel his gaze on her, thoughtful and probing. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds the rhythmic tapping of their shoes and the occasional bark from the dogs. When they reached the park, Jake stopped and turned to her. "Can I ask you something?" Emily's stomach tightened, but she nodded. "Sure. Why do you always look so sad?" The question caught her off guard, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. She opened her mouth to deny it, to laugh it off, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she felt a lump rise in her throat, and she quickly looked away. "I'm sorry," Jake said, his voice soft. "I didn't mean to overstep." "No, it's okay," Emily said, forcing a smile. "It's just complicated." Jake nodded, his expression understanding. "Life usually is." They sat on a bench, the dogs lying at their feet. Emily stared at the playground in the distance, watching a group of children laugh and chase each other. She felt Jake's eyes on her, but she didn't turn to meet his gaze. "You don't have to talk about it," Jake said after a while. "But if you ever want to, I'm here." Emily nodded, her throat still tight. She wanted to tell him everything. About Mark, about the loneliness that had become her constant companion, about the guilt she felt for enjoying Jake's company. But the words stuck in her chest, heavy and unspoken. Instead, she changed the subject. "Do you ever miss having a home base? With all your traveling, I mean." Jake leaned back, stretching his arms along the back of the bench. "Sometimes. But I think home is more about the people than the place. You can always find your way back to the people who matter." Emily glanced at him, her heart aching at the sincerity in his voice. She wanted to believe him, to believe that she could find her way back to the life she'd once dreamed of. But it felt so far away now, like a distant memory she could barely grasp. When they returned to their houses, Jake lingered at her doorstep. "Thanks for walking with me," he said, his smile warm. "It was nice to have the company." "Thanks for inviting us," Emily replied, her voice softer than she intended. Jake hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but then he simply nodded and turned to leave. Emily watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, she leaned against the door, her mind racing. Max nudged her hand with his nose, his way of asking for attention. She knelt down, wrapping her arms around him. "What am I doing, Max?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Max licked her face, his tail wagging slowly, as if he understood her turmoil. Emily buried her face in his fur, letting the tears she'd been holding back finally fall. She didn't know what she was doing, but she knew one thing. Jake had awakened something in her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. And that scared her more than anything. Asterisk. The days grew shorter, the evenings cooler, but Emily's thoughts remained tangled in a web of guilt and longing. Jake's presence had become a constant in her life, a bright spot in the monotony of her days. They walked the dogs together, shared coffee on his porch, and talked for hours about everything and nothing. Each moment with him felt like a stolen treasure, precious and fleeting. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake invited her over for dinner. Nothing fancy, he said, his tone casual, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Anticipation maybe, or hope. Emily hesitated, her fingers tightening around her phone. Mark had called earlier to say he'd be home late again. His voice distant and distracted. "Sure," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll be there." She spent the next hour agonizing over what to wear, finally settling on a simple sweater and jeans. Max watched her from the doorway, his head tilted as if trying to understand her nervous energy. "Don't look at me like that," she said, smoothing her hair in the mirror. "It's just dinner." But it didn't feel like just dinner. When she arrived at Jake's house, the aroma of garlic and herbs greeted her at the door. Jake smiled as he ushered her in. His sleeves rolled up to his elbows and a dish towel slung over his shoulder. "Welcome," he said, gesturing to the cozy dining room. The table was set with candles and a bottle of wine, the soft glow of the flames casting a warm light over the room. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "This is amazing." Jake shrugged, his smile sheepish. "I figured you deserved a break from cooking for one." They sat down to eat, the conversation flowing as easily as the wine. Jake told her about his latest photography project, and Emily found herself opening up about her dreams of writing a novel, something she hadn't shared with anyone in years. "Why don't you?" Jake asked, his eyes intent on hers. Emily hesitated, her fork hovering over her plate. "I don't know. Life, I guess. It's hard to find the time. Or maybe it's hard to find the courage," Jake said softly. His words struck a chord, and Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. She looked away, her gaze falling on the flickering candles. After dinner, they moved to the living room, the dogs curled up at their feet. Jake poured them each a glass of wine, and they sat side by side on the couch, the space between them charged with unspoken tension. "Emily," Jake said after a long silence, his voice low and hesitant, "I need to tell you something." Her heart skipped a beat, and she turned to face him. "What is it?" He set his glass down, his eyes searching hers. "I know this is complicated, and I don't want to make things harder for you. But I can't pretend anymore. Care about you. More than I should." Emily's breath caught, her mind racing. She wanted to tell him she felt the same, that he'd awakened something in her she thought was lost forever. But the words stuck in her throat, tangled with guilt and fear. "Jake, she began, but he reached out, his hand brushing hers. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice gentle. "I just needed you to know." The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with emotion. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, and before she could think, before she could stop herself, she leaned in and kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, but then Jake's hand cupped her cheek, and the kiss deepened, filled with all the longing and desire they'd been holding back. Emily's mind went blank, her body responding to his touch as if it were the most natural thing in the world. When they finally pulled apart, Emily's cheeks were flushed, her breath uneven. She stared at Jake, her heart racing, the weight of what they'd just done settling over her like a heavy blanket. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake shook his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and resolve. "Don't be. It's real, Emily. And we can't keep pretending it's not." Emily stood abruptly, her hands shaking. "I need to go." Jake didn't try to stop her. He simply nodded, his expression pained. She hurried home, Max trailing behind her, his tail wagging as if he didn't understand the turmoil in her heart. When she reached her house, she leaned against the door, her mind spinning. What had she done? Asterisk.